excessive hotel rooms.
So is it normal Qantas practice, Mr Joyce, to every Friday or Saturday night in LA book 2,000 rooms?
Well, I don't know the details of that particular thing, but I've been told in relation to it, Senator, that there was no more additional rooms booked than would have been
And
normal.
I'll go back to mine. So it must be common practice for Qantas every Saturday night to book 2,000 rooms in Los Angeles. You're going to take that on notice for us. And I'd ask you to do the same for Singapore too, if you could, please. And just while I'm on clarification, I will go to Senator Betts. Senator Gallagher asked you about the briefing on the grounding of the fleet, and just so I can clarify this, and you briefed mainly government, you've spoken to members of all political persuasions, I believe. Why would you, Mr Joyce, have been talking about grounding the fleet? What were the reasons being that you had to tell people you might have to ground the fleet? As we made the decision, the reasons why we grounded the fleet was as a result of the lockout. Clearly on the lockout, nothing to do with safety. Okay. No, the reasons why we're grounding the fleet, but I did not talk to people about lockout. But if you look at, I'll go through the decision making for the lockout and what we did with the grounding, because we were in the position where we had. When we made the decision to do the lockout, we had done some planning on it, and the planning that goes back a long while, planning showed that if we made a decision on a lockout for human factors reasons, we had to make an immediate decision to ground the airline. That was the advice I was getting from my safety department. That was the advice I was getting from the AOC holder, who actually is responsible for the operation of Qantas. So when we decided to do the lockout from 8 p.m. on Monday, and we decided, once we'd made that decision, because of those human factors issue, there was needed to be immediate grounding of the airline. So the lockout decision was made first, and then the grounding was as a consequence of that. Okay, Mr Joyce, but I just go back. I mean, if you had to come to me and said to me that you might have to ground the airline and you hadn't mentioned lockout, do you think it would have been fair that you should have, if you're talking about grounding, given a reason why, or do you think that the politicians that you did brief, whether they be ministers, shadow ministers or whatever, could actually take you seriously that you would ground the fleet because there's 1 hour stoppages or the pilots are wearing red ties? It was very clearly for a number of different reasons, and it wasn't just one, that the commercial damage to our operation, as I said, was getting a lot worse. Our forward bookings had collapsed. Our operation was deteriorating. And we were grounding aircraft, as you know, Senator, each week. We had already grounded some aircraft, and that there was an underpinning safety concern because, as I mentioned, I had a note from CASA to say that we were keeping an eye on the potential implications of industrial action. So a combination of any of those factors could have resulted in us grounding the airline. In the end of the day, we grounded the airline as a consequence of the industrial action that took place, to allow us to actually take the only viable mechanism that was available to us to get a negotiated settlement, and that's why we made the lockout decision. Okay, Mr Joyce, I won't go. I'll come back. There are a number of questions because at the time I'm quite sure that on the Saturday morning there wasn't any industrial action going on. I don't think a red tie would bring your company down. But can I answer some of the questions you had on notice, Senator? Yes, if you could, please. I've got them coming through. So. Printers and couriers, as I said, we did do some planning for a potential lockout, and they had been retained for some time, but the printers were only contacted on Saturday and not authorised for distribution until after 5 p.m. announcement. They were confirmed as a final go at 8 p.m. on Saturday. In relation to rooms booked, there were 2,000 rooms booked, but they were booked after the announcement. Okay. And you can table information that shows that? Well, we certainly can get that information to you, yes. They were printed Saturday morning. Mr Joyce, you said you printed Saturday morning? The printing commenced on Saturday and were not authorised for distribution until after 3 p.m. And the time of the printing? I don't know. Was authorised? 11:30 after the board meeting. Okay, and you'll take that on notice for us for written proof of the rooms that have been booked in Singapore and after the announcement. Yes, you'll come back to us with proof. We will come back rather than
you've got the most honest face at the table, Mr Joyce, and I'm not denying that you would ever do anything different.
Thanks,
so
Senator.
Just
We'll
you
come
back
back
to us
on
and
it.
provide
Yep.
that. It's the rest of the committee we've got to appease. And I just, on clarification, now you said, Mr Joyce, that the decision was taken by yourself and put to the board and endorsed Saturday morning
Yes.
of the lockout.
Yes.
Why did you continue, or the company, the Qantas Group, continue to sell tickets after that?
It was, Senator, there was a mistake, because it again shows you that even with all of the planning we had done, and we've done a lot of planning, we did miss this one. We did.
It's not a little one, Senator.
No, it is.
Mr. Joyce.
I know it is, Senator. We do take it seriously, and I'll tell Brett how we discovered that we had a problem there.
What happened was we heard at about 8 o'clock on Saturday night that the website was still open. Honestly, no one had thought about it. It was closed by 8:30.
No one had thought about it. I thought the passengers were the most important thing, but no one thought if you're going to shut down your company,
the passengers are
put
the number one priority.
100,000 people
Senator,
in turmoil, and no one thought
Senator,
about it.
you've got to understand our number one priority at that point in time was the safe grounding of the airline.
I would have thought it would be your
and the management of the
passengers,
70,000
Mr.
passengers
Johnson.
who were being affected.
Can I say, Senator, can I say on this, you know, customers are a huge concern and a top priority for us. I had to say, from my perspective, that, you know, my heart went out to us having to make this decision and disruption it caused. But I have to say, we had 70,000 customers disrupted because of the action that took place up till then, and we had talk of 48 hours disruption. That would have caused this all over again by the unions. If the Lamies had walked off the job for 48 hours, the airline would have been grounded. There was going to be a lot more customers grounded. There would have been a lot more customers grounded if this industrial action had continued for a year. I brought it to a head, Senator, and I do apologise to all of those 90,000 customers that were impacted by it. But we had to bring it to a head because we were going to have so many more, hundreds of thousands of customers impacted over the next year, and Qantas would never have got them back. And the uncertainty it was creating for our customers was so great that we were just losing them. They were not going to come back to Qantas. So we were customer focused in our thinking on this. It was the best thing we could do to keep the customers with Qantas.
Mr Joyce, rather than take up other senators' time, we'll probably have varying differences of opinions, but what I would ask you to take on notice that how many tickets were sold, how many people were affected. I would also ask that you could provide to the committee what measures you'll take to remedy that. I've read pieces in the paper, but we'd rather hear it direct from the company.
And I think on that, Senator, just make a comment that we have been in dialogue, obviously, with the ACCC, and the ACCC have made some suggestions about what do they want to see from Qantas in this.
Over and above what we already offered.
Over and above what we already offered. We're going to meet those ACCC requests, and we're going to go above and beyond that.
Mr Joyce, you were only going to go to midnight until the ACCC gave you a backhander, so let's leave it at that.
No,
let's leave it at that. And
but,
Mr Johnson, if you'd have popped into the airports trying to run that defence with people lined up at the counters who had bought tickets, you wouldn't have got too far.
But Senator, can I say, it was always our intention, and when you'll see on Monday when we come out with what we're doing, we're going way above to apologise to the customers about what actually took place, because, as I said, it was a deep regret that this had to happen to them. And we are doing whatever we can to make sure we can recover the damage that's done to those customers, make sure nobody's out of pocket, and we will be giving people compensation above and beyond what the ACCC have asked for.
OK, we'll look forward to that, Mr Joyce. If you take that on notice for me, that information that the committee requests, it's not me you've got to win over. I still travel Qantas because I believe it has been a great airline, and I support the Qantas employees. On that, Senator Abetz.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Qantas. Just a few follow-up questions. Mr Joyce, you told us that forward bookings had collapsed. Is it too commercial in confidence to give us an indication as to the extent of that collapse?
Yeah, we can. I think I'll just get them from Olivia, but I'll give you some indications I know off the top of my head. For example, we do a survey each month and asking people their intentions to fly with Qantas. Would they consider Qantas for the next trip? And usually internationally, 5% of people would say no. And that had risen to 30% of people were no longer considering Qantas for their international trips, six-fold increase on it. We had on the East Coast, I think
maybe I'll get it for us now. We had a similar impact on the domestic market, where we've seen the propensity of people not to travel with Qantas actually doubling or trebling as well. And most importantly, the core corporate market. The core corporate market was not travelling with Qantas on the East Coast and East-West services because of the uncertainty it has created. I'll get you the exact numbers, Senator, but it was quite significant. We come up with then a financial number, which was it was costing us $15 million a week for the ongoing uncertainty around the airline, in addition to the disruption costs for each of the actions that were taking place.
And I can confirm your indication that CASA had concerns, because I asked CASA some questions at Senate estimates as to whether they were keeping a watch on Qantas in relation to the industrial action. Can I ask, however, in relation to the grounding of the fleet, had you been grounding individual aeroplanes and part of your fleet during the course of what I might describe as the rolling industrial action?
Yes, we have. As a consequence of the industrial action by the licensed engineers, we had to ground aircraft, multiple aircraft over a number of weeks, and we were making schedule cancellations to service as a consequence of this. So this was already in train. And as we said, we had overtime bans. The overtime bans were resulting in less time being made available for us to actually complete the work on aircraft, and that made us take the decision, instead of seeing the entire fleet deteriorate and the operation of the entire fleet get worse like it did in 2008 when we had the last licensed engineers dispute, that we were better off taking aircraft out of operation, cancel those flying and bringing certainty to our passengers.
Right, going to the Act or bill that we are looking at, you indicated earlier that 38% of Qantas Group's capital investment was in Qantas International. Is that what, this year, over the last 5 years? What's that 38%? What period does that relate to?
That's in total. That's the amount of capital we have today in Qantas International, and it is continuing to be the big part of our investment going into Qantas International.
Can you take on notice for us then the more recent years, let's say the last 5 years of investment in Qantas International?
We will do that, Senator.
Yep.
Senator, I could come back on one of your other questions. We've now got the information. So we have high fare, flexible fares, which is our corporate travel. In the month of October, the week of the 17th of October on the East Coast, they were down 40% on the previous years.
Down
40? 40. Mm-hmm. On East-West, that's transcontinental, they were down 14%, and to Canberra, they were down 20%. So we had a massive collapse of our bookings during that period.
All right, so forward bookings collapsing, I think on those figures would be a fair description, but can I come back to the capital investment in Qantas International? What percentage of your turnover or gross income is represented by Qantas International?
Again, I take that on notice, Senator.
Take that on notice. And look, whilst we're taking things on notice, one of the good things of these Senate inquiries is that you get submissions from a whole lot of different parties that often conflict, and it is hard to know exactly where the truth may lie. And I would invite Qantas to have a look at the Transport Workers Union submission and also the Australian Licensed Aircraft Engineers Association, and just take on notice aspects that you might wish to respond to, of course, but for my purposes, on page 4 of the TWU submission, it says, taken together, it is difficult to see how Qantas as a company can effectively control JetConnect, Jetstar, plus the two foreshadowed Asian domiciled airlines, and still comply with the Qantas Sale Act in spirit or otherwise. Yeah. These entities may not use the Qantas name, but Qantas will set the strategic direction and make operational decisions on a day-to-day basis. What is Qantas's response to that allegation? There's a further allegation in the very last paragraph of page 4, the third last paragraph of page 5, and with the licensed engineers, I think it was... and another one on page 14 of the Transport Workers Union submission and page 10 of the licensed engineers. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go through all of them now, but if you could give us written responses,
Yes,
that would be
I might send
very
it to
helpful.
get my General Counsel. He's been involved with the Qantas Sale Act for some time.
All
The
right.
last time this was debated, back in 2007, and he actually testified to the Senate committee on it.
Good, because
So-
I then have some questions
So for-
specifically.
Senator, we will give you written responses. I think that's definite. But just so you understand it, the Qantas Sale Act was drafted primarily to effect the sale of Qantas, the privatisation of Qantas. There was then provisions put in to ensure, to protect Qantas, we will continue to operate as an Australian-based and Australian-designated flag carrier. At the point in time, Parliament, in the Qantas Sale Act, there was a definition of Qantas, which was Qantas Airways Limited, and there's a definition of Qantas subsidiaries, which covered all of Qantas' subsidiaries. In the Act, where Parliament wanted it to apply to Qantas and its subsidiaries, the Act says Qantas and Qantas subsidiaries. In relation to the provision affecting which you were talking about, which applies to the protection of Qantas as the Australian flag carrier, the Act only applies to Qantas. It does not apply to Qantas subsidiaries. The intent at that point in time was to ensure that Qantas, the Qantas Airways Limited was protected, but there was no intention at that point in time to restrict Qantas in investing in subsidiaries.
We actually had a subsidiary.
Yeah, at that point in time there was a subsidiary called Australia Asia Airline, which operated between Australia and Taiwan. And there was a question raised by Senator McGibbon, who was in the opposition at that point in time, and it was he had confirmation from the government that there was no intention for the Act to apply to Australia Asia Airlines.
So does Qantas accept that it applies to the total group, or would you keep the subsidiaries separate?
Those particular provisions only apply to Qantas Airways Limited, just that legal entity.
But the amendment that is now being proposed in the bill before us, that would require it to apply not only to the Qantas group as a whole, but individually to each subsidiary. Is that correct?
Correct. It would make those specific provisions apply to Qantas Airways Limited, its subsidiaries, and its associates.
So if I were to pick, Jetstar Japan or something?
Jetstar Japan, correct.
Yeah. That is only for internal flights within Japan, is that correct?
And potentially some regional flights from Japan,
Into
but not into Australia.
But then there would be maintenance requirements and provisions for Jetstar Japan to have its servicing done in Australia.
If the Act applied, Senator,
if the bill were to be
if the bill was to be enacted, what would happen is the majority of Jetstar Japan's operations would have to be based in Australia, and a majority of its maintenance would have to occur in Australia.
Right, all right. In relation to your board of directors, there's a suggestion as to two qualifications or two directors with certain qualifications. Can I just ask, I suppose you, Mr Joyce, sit in at board meetings, but how often are professional flight operations or engineering issues discussed at Qantas board meetings?
Very rarely. We would have at Qantas Safety Committee meetings, we would get into some of the issues, but we're well represented by our chief pilot, our chief engineer and our head of operations who attend those Qantas Board Safety Committee meetings for both airlines, and it covers off all of the airlines within the group.
And can I ask, what other company, to your knowledge, has a provision either legislatively or within its articles that 100 members with 5% of the shares could stop Qantas or stop the company by application to a court?
I don't think any company that I'm aware of would have any such restrictions.
None,
Well,
Senator.
that is what my research indicated. So the next question is, if such a limitation were to be placed on Qantas, what would be the consequences as to your viability, capacity to compete in what I think we can all agree on is a very competitive market?
I think we have the same view of, obviously, the Department of Transport and the Minister, that these amendments would seriously risk the viability of Qantas going forward. And as Senator Gallagher said, about the prospect of breaking up the Qantas group as a negative, which I think was on the table, which I do think would be a negative, and the current management absolutely believe it would be a negative, this would force us into doing it. And that would expose Qantas. We would lose the profitability of Jetstar. We would lose the profitability. I would lose the ability to operate some services. Would mean that Qantas internationally we couldn't turn around, in my belief. And that would suffer a huge reductions in operations going forward, and it would put the viability of Qantas at risk.
I mean, the perverse outcome of this proposed legislation was, rather than protecting Australian jobs, it actually gives, in what is already a tough battle with foreign airlines flying into Australia, it provides a leg up to our foreign competitors and really puts the Australian airlines at a massive disadvantage in competing in what is an intensely competitive environment. And what we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years is a real retreat in terms of market share as it is, and this would just exacerbate that. So rather than Jetstar being able to compete flying into places like Thailand and into Indonesia and compete with the Chinese carriers and the Thai carriers and the Indonesian carriers, this would put an additional burden just on the Australian carriers, wouldn't put an additional burden on anyone else, and seriously tip the competitive landscape against Australian carriers and therefore destroy Australian jobs.
All right, can I ask, it seems like ages ago, but I think it was only last Saturday, when you were busy making your phone calls, noting the opposition were called last, and I accept that, that's a lot of an opposition, but if it had been indicated to you that government would have been minded to use section 431 of the Fair Work Act, would the Qantas fleet have been grounded on last Saturday?
Well, Senator, I know there's been a huge amount of speculation on it, and again, I think it is very hypothetical around this. The reason why we grounded the fleet was because of the lockout. If the lockout wasn't occurring because there was a call-off of all industrial action, then the fleet wouldn't have been grounded. So I think we've made that clear, but I think it's, again, everything's hypothetical. We are where we are. I take full responsibility for the grounding of the fleet. It was my call. There's nobody else that is responsible for it, and there's nobody else that we'd say should have done something to avoid it. I take full responsibility because I know it's the only thing I could have done in order to bring this to a head. There was nothing else that could have taken place.
All right, but you accept that the government could have stopped you from implementing the lockout under section 431?
Yeah, absolutely. 431 is very clear.
Yeah.
431 would have stopped me taking the industrial action I was taking,
right,
if it was declared, and that would have stopped the lockout.
Right, and in those circumstances, because the grounding was subsequent to the lockout, if the lockout didn't or couldn't occur, then the grounding would not have occurred.
That is correct.
All right, thank you. Can I ask, in relation to the phone calls you made, what was the reaction of government ministers? Was it cool, calm, collected, or was it somewhat warmer, heated, in fact?
No, I think we got a reaction which was, as you'd expect, from both the federal government, the state governments, and from the opposition. That was professional. There were professional, courteous responses to the calls that were made, and I wouldn't have expected anything else from ministers, from opposition members, and for state governments.
So everybody were tidy? Everybody was tidy?
Everybody was tidy.
Right. Oh, that's reassuring, because since then there have been some quite untidy statements made, and so it's just interesting to see that when they actually had the opportunity to talk face to face, they were polite, calm and collected by the sounds of things, but when they had the floor of the Parliament or media to talk to, where they got some extra courage that clearly they didn't have earlier on Saturday. But look, I will leave that at that. Can I go to your submission on page 2?
All right, Senator Cameron, we won't lower our standards to
Senator. So it just shows how little Senator Cameron knows with his conspiracy theories, because I wasn't even personally contacted.
Don't take the interjection.
I got it from a staff member. But
Senator Betts.
yeah,
Senator
this is the dishonesty
Senator
injected
Betts.
into to this public
I'm
debate.
asking you, Senator Betts, that please, if you have questions,
I do
to stay
indeed.
focused and ignore the interjections.
I shall. Page 2 of your submission, third last paragraph, it says, the assertion in the explanatory memorandum that foreign contracts do not include the same flight duty limitations that apply to Australian crew is simply not correct. And I think that was the basis of your commentary to Senator Xenophon's questioning. But I just want to nail that down absolutely, that you stand by that statement categorically.
Absolutely.
All right.
Any of the constraints that apply under the Air Operator Certificate around human factors or fatigue risk management apply to crew irrespective of where they're employed and where they're based.
Right. Now that things have cooled down a bit at the other end of the table, can I ask, in relation to your phone calls to government ministers on Saturday early afternoon, did they ask for more time to consider their position? Did they say, look, can you hold off with this announcement past 5 o'clock so that we can consider our position? Was there any request made that you put things on hold so the government could consider its position?
No, but to be fair, I did say that the timing, we had made a decision and that the airline had to be grounded because of those human factors issues that we mentioned.
So it was a fait accompli.
So we did say that if potentially it did leak, we could bring it forward. So we made it very clear that was the time frame, and there was no discussion about changing that time frame. Nobody asked, nor did I. I suggested.
Nobody asked. In the event that you would have been asked, would you have taken a request from a Prime Minister or a Minister for Transport seriously, and one that would make you reconsider your plan of action?
I think that's a hypothetical, Senator Betts. In all fairness, I've defended Mr Joyce's on the questions from government senators about hypotheticals.
I think it is hypothetical, and I don't know what context it could be raised in or where it could go, Senator. So I'd prefer if we didn't go into scenarios from either side about the hypotheticals on it. I don't think that's fair to either side.
Well, but we have had confirmation, and let's nail this one down, that the government did not ask for extra time or for you to delay the course of action that you had indicated to them.
Nobody asked for any extra time, but nor was it suggested by me, in fairness. We talked about the time frame. And in fact, I did say that it could be brought forward if it was a leak. I was very concerned about because of the risk assessment that was done, the human factors issues. That's why we did it so fast. And the human factors issues, we did emphasise if it did leak, we could bring this thing forward. So that was the only time frames that were discussed within the dialogue.
And once again, the only reason for the grounding was the safety factor.
Yes, because, I mean, Senator, we're very cautious when it comes to safety. And we did when the A380 incident occurred now a year ago to the day. We were the only airline that grounded the A380s because we were concerned about the issues around it. And that they were grounded, I think, for 12 to 18 days. We did during the volcanic ash. We were the only airline, the first airline to ground our fleet here as a consequence of that. So we're always going to take a very cautious position when it comes to safety. When we were doing the planning for the lockout, and which, as I said, had been done for some weeks, one of our people, and it was part, as I say, the planning for this was part of a range of options and a range of scenarios that we were doing. Our head of Qantas operations, Lyle Stranby, involved his chief pilot, and his chief pilot did a risk assessment. That risk assessment said that we would have had a problem in doing the keeping the airline flying until the lockout, and that once we made a decision, we had to ground the airline.
So let's clarify that. Sorry, Senator Betts, mate. You said the reasons being for the grounding was safety.
No, the reasons for the grounding was the lockout.
Exactly, and that's what I just wanted to clear because...
Absolutely. The reasons for the
It may have
lockout are
been-
clearly
yeah,
the
no, that's
lockout. But the reason why, because the lockout was at 8 p.m. on Monday, the reasons for the immediate grounding was that we felt uncomfortable with the human factors risks that we had between that Saturday decision becoming known and the lockout occurring.
And in all fairness to
Which
your
would impact
35,000 employees, the reason for the safety or the human factor, sorry, Senator Betts, what, stress or something, do you think?
No, it's. I mean, there's a number of reports by the ATSB, and there's a number of reports by other institutions around the world. This is not assuming anything malicious or anything like that. This is distractions, and distractions could actually cause you the problem. And there's been various cases around the world that when it came to issues on the table, people get distracted, and that can lead to human factors issues that can cause you incidents or accidents, and we needed to avoid it. That's why we took a very cautious approach.
Thank you for that answer. Sorry, Senator.
No, thank you. Yeah. Oh, well, we're at 10:30 and
I'll
there are
tell
a
you
few
what we'll
others.
do.
Yeah.
Sorry, Senator Xenophon, there's a bit of a subcommittee meeting going on. Senator Betts is of the view that, and quite rightfully so, in the running order we have in the program, Qantas finishing at 10:30, and I think with your indulgence, Mr Joyce, that there's going to be a lot more questions that want to be asked, and we ask, could you please stay with us a little bit longer?
Yeah, we can stay a bit longer.
And because with the great help of our next witnesses, they're all going to be shuffled back a little bit. So what I'd ask senators, if we could probably, I'm going to go to Senator Brown next. We have scheduled a 10:30 finish for Qantas, 11:15 for the morning tea break. I'm going to suggest with the support of my colleagues that we work through the morning tea break, and if we can, Joyce, you here to 11:15?
Can we do it in 20-30 minutes, Senator, because I have to get to a flight?
I'm just going to pull out the calculator, so you'd like to be able
If you ring up, you won't be able to change your flight.
I can, Senator, but I've also got other commitments as
Mr Joyce,
well.
you've got flexibility in your workforce, flexibility in your ticketing sales, I'm sure they won't.
He doesn't
No,
have the government planes that you do.
OK, we'll leave that one. All right, so your wish is to be out by 10 to 11.
Yes.
If that's the case, and I'm keen to work with everyone, Mr Joyce, we may have to ask you to come back because there's going to be a heap of questions, and what we probably do is put a heap of questions on notice to you and give you, the company, a choice to a chance to come back.
Notice or you do it.
I don't want you to miss your plane.
So you want... Sorry, we do them on those?
I think she's telling you another flight. You've got to change flight. Yeah.
Well, Senator, let's keep it going with the questions and see where you are and what you need to do. And then if we need to do them on notice, I'd be prepared to do that. If we can try and finish it here today, that's my preference.
And I think you are the same as me. We prefer not to have questions left on notice. We'd rather have them answered as you have proved to us over the last few hearings that you've been in front of us too.
I think it would be. So let's try and get, if I can, get this finished today. Yep. And then any questions that you need to follow through, then we do a notice. I think that, so whatever we need to do in order to do.
Okay, but bearing in mind there are planes to catch for our other witnesses too. Thank you for that. Thank you, Senator Betts. I'm going to go to Senator Brown, and Senator Brown and Senator Ludlam have got a few, and then Senator Eggleston's got a couple. Senator Cameron, who's quietly waited back there for most of the time, has some questions. So I'll go to Senator Brown and Ludlam together, then Senator Cameron, Senator Eggleston and Senator Xenophon to finish off. Just two questions. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Chair. I've been listening, Mr Joyce, carefully to your evidence to this committee. And what's become clear is it wasn't the grounding of the fleet that was central to your plan, but it was the lockout, which then required the grounding to take place. Yet you've told the committee that you've been in, we know, in extensive contact with members of Parliament from the Prime Minister down, including members of the opposition, although no approach was, as far as I'm aware, made to the Greens. But you had...
Sorry, Senator, that's not true. I did meet with one of your Member of Parliament.
Okay. But the evidence before this committee is that you set out in at least the week before the grounding of the fleet
to deceive the government and this parliament by withholding your plan to create a lockout. That's true, isn't it?
No, it isn't, Senator. What we did is made very clear the position that the company was in, and it's in the Act, the Fair Work Australia Act, that the company has the alternative as its course of industrial actions to take a lockout. So we made it very clear.
You knew that, didn't you?
We knew that was always an option, but everybody knows it's always an option because it is part of the Act.
But you said you've told this committee that you hadn't talked to any party about the lockout before that Saturday.
We hadn't talked to any party about the lockout. We hadn't talked to any party about a whole series of studies, but we had. But Senator, can I answer? We had talked to all of the parties about this position that the company was in. We talked to all of the parties about the operational, commercial and safety issues that we were facing, and we talked to all of the parties about the likelihood of us having to grounding the fleet at late notice, and that was discussed with all parties.
Yes, but you've made it clear to this committee, Mr. Joyce,
yes,
that the core of your plan was a lockout, which then necessitated the grounding. But you spoke to the Prime Minister, the Minister for Transport, their opposition numbers about the grounding, but you deceived them by not saying you were aiming at a lockout, didn't you?
I don't agree with that, Senator. Everybody knows the clauses in the Fair Work Australia Act. Everybody knows that the company has the ability to do a lockout. It's the only industrial relations activity that we can.
But you've told this committee, Mr. Joyce, that you've told this committee,
Senator,
Mr. Joyce, that you've told this committee.
Hang on, Senator Brown. Sorry, I was just talking to Senator Xenophon. Sorry. So, is there a point of order, Senator?
Yes. If Mr. Joyce could finish his answer before Senator Brown rudely, asks his next question and not rudely interrupt.
I would encourage allowing Mr. Joyce to finish his question, Senator Brown. You have the call, Mr. Joyce.
So, Senator, it was very clear, as I keep on saying, that the position that we had was that we explained all of the issues that the airline's facing. We expressed our views on the further deteriorations that are going to take place and the grounding could take place. Now, I have to say that it is very clear to everybody on the Fair Work Australia Act, which is the act we're working in, that the only way that the management could actually handle once you've made the decision of how we bring this to a close was to take the action of a lockout. That resulted in the airline being grounded, and absolutely is the case. It was the case. We were focused all the way through those weeks in us negotiating an outcome with the unions. We had continuously been involved with the unions in conciliation. Lockout was only one option that was available to us. We actually had dialogue even in the hours up to the AGM with some of the unions about what would occur. So that was our prime focus. That's what we were trying to do. And it's only when we got to a position where we knew that the unions were going to escalate the dispute, we knew that the action was unacceptable to the continued operation of the company, that we made the lockout decision. Yeah. And when the lockout decision was made, then the fleet was grounded.
Yes, but you've told the committee that you were well aware that the government could use Section 431 to prevent a lockout. And you went about deliberately withholding your plan for a lockout from the Prime Minister of this country and the Minister for Transport because you didn't want that section to be used. That's true, isn't it?
No, that's not true. That's not true, Senator. We were in a position where we knew what our alternatives on the Fair Work were. I think the government knew what they could do in terms of intervention, and that was up to the government to decide what it was going to do.
Why did you not raise your central plan of a lockout with the Minister for Transport or the Prime Minister in the days leading up to last Saturday?
Because we only made that decision on the Saturday, and once I made that decision, we told the ministers, and we formed the Prime Minister's office once that decision was made. But no decision was made because our prime focus was on negotiating with the unions and trying to get it resolved. When the decision was made, we informed the people.
But on your own evidence, you're not credible on that matter, Mr. Joyce, because you've told the committee that you spoke with presumably the Prime Minister and the Minister for Transport about grounding the fleet.
We did.
But your aim in grounding the fleet was a lockout.
The result of what happened on the weekend was the lockout resulted in the grounding of the fleet. But I have to say, you know, in the dialogue about locking out, it doesn't take much to realise that as a consequence of that, as part of that, we would be locking out people. Because the issue was, how do we bring it to a close? And the issue was, as a consequence of the action that took place, what did we do? So the only alternative that we had was to take the decision under Fair Work Australia of doing to do the lockout, and then the fleet was grounded. But it's very clear for anybody that understands the clauses in Fair Work Australia, for anybody that understands the operation of the airline, that the lockout and, as a consequence of the grounding, go hand in hand. They go together.
So when you negotiated, or when you spoke with the Prime Minister, the Minister for Transport, or their opposite numbers, and presumably repeatedly talked about grounding the fleet, but not about a lockout, which was the central plank of your plan, as it turned out, you expected that the people you were talking to in this Parliament should work out that your real plan was a lockout, even though you weren't using that term and you weren't pointing to that outcome.
Senator, we were very clear in where we were as an airline. We were very clear that we were working through the negotiations with the individuals, unions, to try and get it resolved. We were very clear that the current situation, which was a death by 1,000 cuts, could not be sustainable. We were very clear that we had three alternatives to us. We had the alternative of conceding to the demands which would endanger the future of the airline. We were very clear that the other alternative was that we continue to die down to the 1,000 cuts. We were very clear with all parties that that couldn't continue. We were very clear that this could get to a grounding of the airline. Now, I can't be any clearer than that in terms of our intentions.
So you were very clear about everything, but you're very obscure and devious about the fact that you're aiming at a lockout.
Sorry, Senator, I think that's absolutely inappropriate to say. We were very clear on our approach all the way through.
But I'm afraid I have to take you to task on this and to ask you to explain the behaviour which led to you misleading. And I say that as a result of your own evidence, Mr Joyce, this government and this Parliament, about your central plan to lock out your workers, which would then necessitate the grounding of the fleet, because you spoke repeatedly about potentially grounding the fleet, but you never once conveyed your real plan, which was the lockout. Now, how can you be believed when that's the pattern of information transfer you give to ministers of the Crown?
Can I say, Senator, and to make it very clear, the lockout wasn't our plan all along, so you're incorrect on that.
You said you were talking about it for weeks.
We're talking about the grounding of the airline for weeks.
You told the committee that.
But yes, I did, and I said very clearly, I said that there was talk about the grounding of the airline for weeks. But there's various different ways the airline could be grounded. And there was lots of different alternatives in which it could have happened. And I'll go through a range of them, Senator, because because I think that's important. First of all, the airline could have been grounded because the engineers or the unions fulfilled their notice, their intentions of taking 48 hours or 72 hours notice.
Yes,
if that occurred, sorry, Senator, can I finish?
Yes, you can.
Senator Brown, I would urge you once again just to let Mr Joyce finish. If the question is long-winded and I think that it's not getting to the point of your question, I will certainly raise it with Mr Joyce.
And I think I answered the Senator's questions in relation to how the airline could be grounded and why lockout was only one of the ways in that could have occurred. Because there was the alternative that the airline could have been grounded because of the union action, and that would have resulted in the airline having to be grounded for the same period. There's the potential that because of increased safety concerns, that CASA could have continued, and they gave us that warning, could have grounded the airline because of the action that was taking place. There was the potential that the deterioration of the operation over periods of time would have resulted in the grounding of the airline, and there was the potential that a lockout would result in the grounding of the airline. So there was a range of them. And I mentioned CASA. So CASA
Yes,
would have
but the
grounded.
difference in all those proposals that were alternatives that you put up there and the one that was used, which is the lockout, is that you alone made the decision that there was going to be a lockout. You've told the committee that. You've told us that it was a potential in the air for weeks. It was evolving in your mind, but you didn't tell the government or the Prime Minister of this country that that was an impending a plan that you were going to put into action, did you?
As I kept on saying, Senator, we worked through our process through those weeks of negotiating with the unions. We had hundreds of meetings with the unions in order for us to get a negotiated settlement. Lockout was the last resort, and I've always said it was the last resort about where we would get to. It was the last resort for the organisation. We had 35 meetings with the pilots, 35 meetings with the lamies. We had lots of meetings in Fair Work Australia. And we were worried about the performance and the reasons why the airline could be grounded for a range of reasons, and that's what we'd communicated. You're right, I didn't go through the potential of the lockout. I didn't go through in detail the potential or at all about CASA grounding. I didn't go through the unions grounding it. They were all possibilities. They were all possibilities, and I think everybody that was involved in the dialogue would have known they were all possibilities, and they would have known that each of those could have been the reason why the airline could have been grounded.
Well, we're talking to the unions and to CASA later, Mr Joyce, but we're talking to here about your option. And you had a big stick behind your back and you didn't show it to anybody. And the reason, I put this to you as a question, the reason you didn't show that is because you didn't want the government to intervene and prevent the lockout you were planning. That's true, isn't it?
No, it's not, Senator. We are in a position where Fair Work Australia, Fair Work Australia gives us the ability to take industrial action as well. There has to be balance between a company and its employees. There's nobody complaining about the massive industrial action that took place with the unions over an extended period that was putting at risk the 35,000 people, death by 1,000 cuts, was going to result in thousands, had resulted in 70,000 passengers disrupted, and it was going to last another year. Nobody was complaining over that action. That was killing Qantas. I had to do something. I did take a significant decision, I know, in having to do the lockout. I did it because it was the only way to bring this to an end. And it is very clear in Fair Work Australia that the employer has that ability. So it's not a big stick hidden behind your back. It's actually there for everybody to see and everybody to know. It is in the legislation. It's built into the legislation. For employers to be able to defend themselves, do the right thing, and to bring this to a head, which it was brought to, and brought security and certainty to all of our customers, to all of our employees and to our shareholders going forward. That's what this had to do, and it was the only alternative that was left with me.
If you had told, just one more question on that, if I may, Chair.
Thank you.
If you had told the government that you planned a lockout, you knew that the government could thwart that plan by invoking Section 431, didn't you?
No, again, your premise is completely wrong of the question, Senator. We did this because we had only one viable alternative under Fair Work Australia to respond to the union action, which is the lockout. That is the only action, viable action that we had that we could actually do. We took that action. And then the lockout, it was up to the government to decide what they needed to do. The risk assessment was very clear. The grounding of the airline happened because we could not continue the operation of the airline until the lockout happened. That's clear. They're the facts. They're the truth.
I think it's probably worth stating.
With Mr Buchanan, if I have a letter here, Mr Buchanan, dated Wednesday the 20th.
Sorry, Senator.
I just want to ask him if it's valid.
But
That's
Mr
all.
Buchanan was going to answer very briefly, and then we'll come back to you, Senator Brown, and Senator Loveland has a couple, but I'm going to go to Senator Cameron because I'm not going to get belted up.
Okay.
Once Qantas leaves, Senator Cameron hasn't had a chance to ask questions.
I was just going to say it's worth stepping back, I think, a little bit and say what's the broader challenge here for the aviation industry. I know the issues of last Saturday and Monday are pertinent and obviously politically getting a lot of discussion, but this is an airline that's losing a lot of money. And if you look around the world, what are the options what would have happened to Qantas over the long run? And you see a series of airlines have either disappeared, and this is a very tough competitive industry, and lots of airlines have disappeared, or airlines use bankruptcy, and lots of our US airlines go into bankruptcy, or we've seen airlines get bailed out by government, like Japan Airlines recently, Air New Zealand not too long ago. And they're the options, I think, would have presented this committee and this government if management hadn't acted.
Yeah, I have a letter, Mr Buchanan, which flags the lockout on Saturday, dated the Wednesday before October the 26th, and it's purporting to come from you. Would you kindly look at that for the committee and just...
I know the letter, quite, yeah.
And has it been falsified?
No, the letter is absolutely true. The letter was written on Saturday afternoon with myself and my team, communications team. Unfortunately, in the haste of reacting very quickly to try and get information out to our staff so they were all informed, we called people in late Saturday to write that letter. They took a letter from Wednesday, another internal communications that I'd used, copied and pasted the final communication that we agreed to send to all staff onto that and sent it out. And I think what's quite obvious here is when you're moving quickly, mistakes and little typos like that will happen, but it was about getting information out quickly to staff.
It's clearing the air. I'd table the letter if I may.
Thank you, Senator.
And I have to say, Senator, as I already said, I had trouble actually getting Bruce on the day because he had no notice of what was taking place, and said to me when I rang him, "Is this important? Do we need to actually to be involved in it?" And I said, "It's very important. I need you involved in this call." So that is the conversation that took place. So Bruce had actually no forward knowledge of this in any way until the day where we made it.
Now, on that, it is 10:02. I'm not winding up, but you did mention 20 minutes to me at 10:30. Yep. Mr Joyce, are you online to be able to stay?
Yeah, I can stay for a bit longer, Senator.
Okay, all right. Senator Ludlam and then Senator Cameron, then Senator Eggleston.
Thanks, Chair. When did you form a view, Mr Joyce, that the time to pull the trigger on the various contingencies that you've assembled over the preceding weeks and months would be directly after your AGM?
We are always keeping all of our options reviewed all of the time, so there wasn't a decision about when a trigger would be applied. There was continuous review of everything, and things were dynamic, things were changing every day, things were different every day, so there wasn't a particular moment and where that trigger was pressed.
Well, it was right after your AGM. That's a fairly significant moment in the corporate calendar. When did you...
So on the Saturday, yes, the decision was made to do the lockout and to ground the airline, and that happened on the Saturday. The timeline on the Saturday was that I called for a board meeting in the morning of Saturday morning. Yeah. We had the board meeting organised for 10:30. I then took the board through my decision. I then told them the reasons for it. That lasted around an hour and a half, and then we had. Around an hour. Then we had an executive committee meeting at 12, which I brought the senior leadership team of the company together to talk and tell them about the decision. And then we went into implementing the decision.
Now, I recognise all of that. I think most of that's already on the record. My question was, when did you form a view that immediately after the AGM would be an appropriate time to set this into motion?
So at the AGM, it was very clear that the rhetoric that was coming out of the individual unions was meant out, instead of just getting to the threshold issue, the watershed issue, where we believed that the unions may come back to the table and actually negotiate. Okay. The rhetoric got worse. We were talking about 48-hour stoppages.
No, I recognise all of that. I will cut you off because you're quite short of time. We've got all day. So you woke up on Saturday morning not knowing that by Saturday night this would all be in motion. Is that effectively
I woke up Saturday morning and we made the decision on Saturday.
Okay.
I made the decision on Saturday. And I did that as a consequence of digesting what took place at the AGM, where the company was, what was taking place all the way up to that period of time, called the board meeting, made a decision with the board, and then implemented that as a consequence of that. It was very clearly made on Saturday, and so absolutely
nobody on the board and nobody on your executive team, there's no piece of paper floating around that suggests that all this stuff that's poised and assembled and ready to roll out, push the button on the printing, get everything in motion, would be triggered right after your AGM?
We had planning that was going on for weeks.
I'm talking about the timing, about when you pull the trigger on these events.
Well, we've had planning that was going on for weeks that would have covered all aspects of what we were doing,
including when you would do it.
There was no timings, scenarios around timings that were worked through. We did have everything lined up. We did only do one thing around timings if we were doing it, which is what's the ideal time during a week of us doing this. So we had looked at timings during the day when different flights were, scenarios over the weeks to minimise the risk to the operation, because it was important for us to also look at how many flights were flying. But there was no planning. That the planning that we were doing and the planning that we did for weeks was all around the possibility that this, as a last resort, will be an alternative that we would implement.
Yeah.
And how would we do it from an operations point of view? How would we do it from a safety point of view? And how would we do it from a commercial point of view?
I think the concept of the lockout and the shutdown of the airline as a last resort is probably seriously in dispute, but we'll move on.
Sorry, Senator, it is absolutely the last resort. We were very clearly, in good faith, negotiating all the way up to that last moment, and we were hopeful that we could try and get agreements. But when the rhetoric escalated at the AGM, when we saw the damage it was doing the company, and when I saw I had no other alternative, we made the decision to do it. So that was the last resort, and it will always be the last resort. Grounding an airline like Qantas is a huge decision, and it's a decision done because we had nowhere else to go.
All right. I again put to you that matter is in dispute. In the Fair Work Act, a union who decides to shut an employer down or shut a business down is required to give 72 hours notice, and you're not under the terms of the Act. Is that your understanding? You can pull the trigger at a moment's notice?
My understanding, because our action was in response to the union action.
The unions hadn't shut your airline down. You shut the airline down.
But they had been taking action which had caused 70,000 passengers to be
Can we get to my question, though? The unions need to give you 72 hours to ground the airline or take that kind of significant industrial action, whereas you're able to do it at the drop of a hat.
As a result of the union action, we are able to do it. That's what the Act says.
Yeah.
But can I say, we didn't lock people out immediately. The lockout notice were 8 p.m. on the Monday. And they were only lockout notices, again, to those people, those parts of our employees that were taking the industrial action. All of other employees were told that they would be paid and that we would continue with the payments, and they wouldn't be affected by this.
But there's still an asymmetry in the Act between timing of what you have the ability to do and what the trade unions have the ability to do. Adam Bant, the member for Melbourne, is proposing a bill which would require an employer to give the same amount of lead time either for a lockout or for preparatory action, a lockout or preparatory actions such as a grounding. Would you support provisions like that going into the Fair Work Act?
I have to say, I mean, we will comply with wherever is in any of the acts as we've always done. And I have to say, we did not lock out, again I repeat, we did not lock out our employees with immediate effect. There was notice given, and it was 8 p.m. on the Monday. It was not on the day that we grounded the airline.
There's not much point turning up at work if the airline's not flying, though, is there?
Yeah, but people were being paid.
Yeah.
And we were paying people because all the way, including the employees that were taking the action between that time of the airline grounded and the lockout taking place. We didn't issue them with instructions as we could have that the lockout occurred from when the airline was grounded.
Okay, so in this instance, you don't think there would have been any impediment to you rolling out exactly the same plan if you were required to give 72 hours notice as the unions are?
There wouldn't have been any difference in the plan.
That's interesting. In your opening statement, you mentioned 90% of your maintenance is in Australia, 92% of your staff are based here. The Act doesn't prevent you from going much lower than that, does it? You could go right down to 50% in a bit if you chose to.
Absolutely, but we are the only airline that does its heavy maintenance here.
Yeah.
None of our competitors do. We're the only airline that has that level, as far as I know, around the world. That's a huge level of employees based in its home country. So we are very committed to Australia, have been very committed to Australia, and have a huge investment here in this country.
You do. But it's not a legislated minimum. My reading of the Act is that it could go much lower than that if you made decisions to offshore your maintenance or more of your staffing.
I have to say that we have made that commitment. We've spent a fortune on heavy maintenance maintenance facilities.
Yeah.
We've spent a fortune on, we're the only company in the country that actually has an apprentice program for engineering. So we're making a commitment for the future of this in Australia. And I would probably ask you, Senator, maybe having a look at other airlines and seeing should they be making the same commitment into Australia that Qantas is, because it seems Qantas is always at the thin edge of the wedge on this one and get the criticism for what it's doing when it's doing the right thing for Australia and other airlines aren't.
Do you propose to keep your maintenance staff and activity at those levels, above 90% indefinitely, or are there proposals to wind that back?
There aren't any proposals to vary it, but over time we have varied that. It has moved over time, depending on the overflow of maintenance, where maintenance is going to be. And we have not made a decision about where we're going to do the A380 or the 787 maintenance, because they are a long time away. And so I can't speak for the next 20 or 30 years, because I don't know.
What about the next 5?
We have with this. There's no plans for us to do anything else except for the maintenance that we have in Australia. So I don't know how that number will vary, because there may be circumstances outside of my control that may make it different. But we have a huge commitment to doing heavy maintenance here, and that commitment will continue.
Okay, but you're not necessarily committed for the big long-haul jets that you're purchasing and the process of bringing into the fleet for the maintenance to remain in Australia for those?
Because, we have new technology coming into the airline all the time, and part of new technology is the maintenance does change. It's the same as your car 20 years ago. The maintenance that you did on it is very different than the maintenance